Welcome to the second monthly presentation hosted by S4Geo, the Society for Geopolitics. I'm Roger Baker, a co-founder at S4Geo. S4Geo is designed as a community where geopolitical risk analysts, internationally engaged businesses, and academia can come together to assess and improve tools and techniques, to ensure relevance for business interests and operations, and to collaboratively strengthen the field of applied geopolitics. Working together with business schools and training programs, we will use these insights to help integrate geopolitical thinking and processes into business education from the start, enhancing business competitiveness in a changing global system. S4Geo is not another consultancy or analysis shop. It's a convening body for the emerging industry to share ideas and challenges, to hone tools and techniques, and to provide actionable guidance to future analysts. During our presentation today, if you're interested in asking a question, please type it into the question and answer box. We will get to as many questions as we can before the end. And now today, I'm very pleased to host Richard Lohmeyer, a senior partner at Kearney and the global lead at Kearney Foresight Services. He previously served as the senior advisor for long-term strategic planning at the U.S. Department of State. He's a member of the advisory board of the World Economic Forum's Global Foresight Network. Thank you for joining us today, Rudolph.
It is my great pleasure and a great privilege to be with you all today. Thank you so much, Roger. Great to see you again, and great to be with this important audience. I realize it is an audience of experts, and so I'm going to I've tailored my opening remarks in consideration of that fact. And of course, we're meeting at this remarkable moment. It's hard to imagine a more challenging, concerning, and important moment for us to have this discussion than today. I served Kearney for 10 years in the Middle East, where I led our National Transformations Institute, which is our Foresight and International Affairs Center of Excellence based in Dubai. And I've been for the last 5 days constantly on the phone with colleagues on the ground there, and it's quite remarkable to hear from them what it's like to be on the ground of a very stable city that's now having shockwaves passing through windows. And so I think it gives a certain healthy seriousness to this conversation. I'm going to walk you through very quickly some slides. They may err a bit on the side of grooviness, as I joke with Roger. But I think that they're important because they give a visual framework to understand some of the points, which otherwise might be a little bit conceptually knotty. But the subject of this discussion, as I know you all know, is strategic optionality. Optionality, the concept of optionality is not new, but because of the advantages, the advances in artificial intelligence, which we've all been witnessing, it has become possible now to design methodologies for doing our work that previously would have been impossible because of the sheer volume of calculations and estimations needed. And so, as I mentioned to Roger in preparation for this session, this is the first time in my career where we conceived a methodology that would have been inconceivable without the support of those technologies, as you'll see. It's not about those technologies, but those technologies allowed us to conceive of something that otherwise would have been extremely, extremely ambitious. So with no further ado, let me share this presentation and get everything up and running. And just, Roger, perhaps please let me know when it is full screen. Does that do it?
Yes, it does.
Fantastic. Okay. So just briefly, and I promise this opening set of comments is really going to be very brief. I'm timing myself. Freedom of action. So building strategic optionality into long-term planning. An important premise of this work is that, as we all know, many of you are Foresight practitioners, this is not about things we may have to do in the future. This is about what can be done now in systematic consideration of the future. And that's the premise of all of our work. But with optionality, it takes on a very specific form. This slide is intentionally oblique. Germany entered 2022 with an extremely path-dependent exposure, as you all know, to Russian pipeline gas. And it is a great example of the cost of lacking optionality and the opportunity to build optionality. So when those flows, as we know, were suddenly curtailed, Berlin had very, very few good options. We've heard that in many different contexts. There are several options and they're all bad. In a way, the intent of this effort, the intent of this methodology is precisely to make that less the case, to maximize the extent to which, even in difficult circumstances, we have and leaders have good options. That's what it's all about. So, as you know, Germany had fallen really into a structural dependence on Russian gas because of long-term contracts, pipeline investments, and so forth. 55% of Russia's gas, 35% of its oil, and 45% of its coal all came from Russia when 2022 happened. And so, of course, Germany also had made the very fateful decision after Fukushima, as you know, to accelerate its closure of its nuclear reactors. So really, it had unintentionally engineered itself into a deep state of structural dependence. When the shock occurred, of course, and the flows were curtailed, and there simply were very few options. The EU ultimately managed to recreate a measure of energy security, as you know, but at tremendous cost. And I think that's the key. It's to understand the extent to which when we lose optionality, we put ourselves in a strategically disadvantaged position. And the solution is often extremely unnecessary, difficult investment. That's often the solution. And of course, many strategic actors, be they companies or countries, are not in a position to they cannot throw money at a problem. They're not in a position to make the investments they might need to escape from such a situation. So, of course, we know that Germany's response was later extraordinary, and German people have many reasons to be very, very proud of that. But the expense of the transition was vast. And so, what is then strategic optionality and where does it derive from? It pertains from the fact that we can anticipate the critical decision points that we are most likely to face. Critical decision point, and this comes out of military doctrine, as many of you know, are junctures in space and time that are identified, and this is key, in the planning process when we can anticipate that leadership must make a decision concerning a specific course of action. So this unit of analysis, critical decision points, is key to understanding this methodology. We can anticipate the universe of decisions that we're likely to have to make or that we may have to make in a given circumstance. And on that, everything hinges. When we can anticipate those decision points and when we can pre-stage options and the capabilities that enable those options, we create leverage. As Lawrence Friedman would say, we are in effect creating power because by having that ready, which we know we will need at some point in the future or we're likely to need, and having the options that correspond to that, we can then respond early in the evolution of a change and shape its trajectory. Whereas if we don't, if we lack time, if we have to spend the resources financially or expend the time, of course, as that process unfolds, we lose discretion, we lose leverage, and we are in reactive mode, as we all know. And so then the way we define strategic optionality in this context for us to discuss, I can't wait to get the discussion going, it refers to the extent to which an organization facing a critical decision point amid rapidly changing circumstances has a wide range of viable choices or options to respond. It's not just to respond to challenges, but also, of course, to capture opportunities. Just to make this a bit more clear in the context of food security. So let's take a government example. So if we have laid out a national food security strategy, for example, by the way, we developed this methodology in close partnership with the UAE Prime Minister's office, which is why my heart is breaking at what my friends and colleagues in that country are going through as we speak today. But we developed this together with them. And as an example, we took food security and imagine a long-term food security strategy, which of course would consist of multiple programs. Consider just one program, which might be for a 10-year strategy to increase food supply resilience. And that strategy would have a baseline pathway, right? The core known pathway of that strategy. That's where it would start. But of course, we can anticipate two sets of things about the future. We can anticipate the structural changes most likely to affect that strategy and the potential strategic shocks, discrete specific events that may occur that may alter it. And therefore, by anticipating those shocks and those structural shifts, of course, as you see the multiple lines of this I-shaped diagram, we can imagine if this were to occur, what is the adaptation that would likely be necessary? What is the alternative pathway? How might we alter our pathway if we knew that that structural shift would occur, or if it did occur? And so that would represent, of course, a decision point. So if there were a discontinuous extreme weather event, for example, to take a strategic shock, that would represent a decision point at which we would need to have options of how to revise our strategy. So let's just dive into that. So should that occur then, right? So for example, reducing climate exposure. If there had been this discontinuous acceleration of extreme weather events, then we can think through what are the options that we would want to have. And there are a range of options that in that circumstance, in an ideal world, we would have. The reference to artificial intelligence that I made earlier is because if you think of the volume of these estimations, it's vast, right? There are many, but you'll see how we solve that pragmatically in the end. And so for then each of those pathway options, we need to be able to execute them. And so the term dynamic engine is, for those of you who've done capability-based planning in the military, you'll understand the concept well. It's an integrated package of strategic capabilities that enables the delivery of intentional outcomes, and crucially, across a range of operating conditions. So why not just call it capabilities? Because it's a constellation of capabilities defined by its robustness across a wide range of circumstances. That's crucial. So then for each of those options that we identified earlier, we can identify the capabilities that we would need to respond. A capability, of course, is an integrated set of people, process, and technology that enables you to achieve an effect. Now, if you consider the vast number, of course, for each decision point, if we think through then the vast number of capabilities required for all of those options, we can also identify then those capabilities that provide the most valuable optionality across the greatest range of circumstances. And for those of you who are scenario planners, which has been my primary functional domain of practice for years, you'll understand this well. This is mathematically derived robustness. So these are those capabilities that across the range of circumstances most relevant to our strategy provide most optionality in most cases. They're not just discrete, they're constellations. So it requires innovation because we know we can't build the full universe of discrete capabilities. We have to prioritize. We're constrained by our budgets. So we have to maximize the strategic value of each investment. And so that's what this is geared to do. So by identifying those that are most robust, dynamic engines that are most robust, it's a finite set of investments that maximizes optionality across the range of pathways that we may have to take. And so the idea is that as these changes unfold, we would have ideally, perhaps we've anticipated them, but that's not the intent. It's not prediction. It is by having systematically considered such a broad range, we have then built and invested in the capabilities needed to respond to those. So the key idea is it's not only about resilience, especially for a country. Building optionality in this disciplined and systematic way is actually a specific means of strengthening national sovereignty. One of the things we have most observed for the last 5 years, and this is the advantage of being a person who leads a think tank in Kearney, but also a consultant, is the extent to which our clients, national governments, and global corporations have been systematically trying to reduce their exposure to coercion. This is a means of reducing exposure to coercion by building genuinely viable options across a range of possible future circumstances before they occur. Douglas North, the great institutional economist, explained that institutions are those things that human societies build to create adaptive capacity. And so the intent of this methodology is to be an instrument of that adaptive capacity to help us in advance build the capabilities we need to adapt. Had Germany, for example, done this work, they wouldn't have put themselves in the position they found themselves, and it would have changed the calculus, not just of how they could respond. I would argue it would have changed the calculus of the invading country. because they would have realized the optionality that their target had. And with that, enough slides and enough talking on my part. I look forward to the discussion, Roger. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. I do want to remind everyone, if you want to take part in this discussion or ask questions as we go through, please enter them into the question and answer box, and we'll get to them as we go through. I guess two things I want to start off with that are particularly relevant here, and this is both for people who are new in the field and people who have been in it for a long time. One is something that I think you have noted, maybe not directly, and that is the way in which lessons from the military can be applied to businesses and things of that sort. Because at its very basic level, the military is an incredibly complex logistics organization that operates all the time in environments that do not match what they had anticipated. So maybe play out a little bit more of how either you have drawn from that or other people can start drawing from those experiences to at least build their repertoire of how to think.
I love it. So I'm sure, as probably all of you know, even the word strategy, which of course comes from strategos, comes from a military context. Well, the same is true of foresight. Foresight had its origins in the military context because, as many of us on this call know, in the context of life or death, and in the fact that in the military environment, the relative capabilities of two parties in a conflict is determined by that even a small increment of advantage. And so, in that context, understanding the future of advantage and building it in advance was always crucial in the military. And because it is a life and death enterprise, it is a filter of pure, substantive, what's the polite phrase? No nonsense ideas, to avoid profanity on this call. So that's why I've always considered the principles of strategy that emerge from warfare to be such reliable guides to what's true and what works. To Roger's wonderful question. Specifically in this case, even going back to Clausewitz, the idea of branches and sequences in military planning deeply informed our thinking of this. So understanding in a given battlefield, very concrete terms, what may occur and do we have, so branches, sequences, and reserves and buffers. So in the military context, by the way, it's amazing, Roger, that we're discussing this today, because as we all know, buffers right now are, I would argue, the crux of what we are watching occur in the Middle East. And just specifically for everybody's benefit, it is the extent to which that the reserves of technology required to maintain the ballistic missile shield that is now protecting human beings across the Middle East, the depth of those reserves, of those buffers, is the critical determinant of the success of this enterprise. Because to the extent that the time required to reduce or eliminate the ability of Iran to launch missiles, to the extent that that is done within the resource constraints of our reserves of missile defense technology, then there is success. And to the extent that those reserves are exhausted before that aim has been accomplished, of course, it's a very different strategic calculus. So it's actually at the crux of what's happening right now. I didn't anticipate talking about that, but it couldn't be more apropos. It is, I would argue, the heart of the matter of what we're witnessing right now. And no doubt why the militaries involved are working with absolute maximum speed. So having said that, then, when one thinks about branches and sequences and reserves, this just takes it one notch further to not just say about reserves of the resources that in the military context one knows that one would need. This is about identifying capabilities that will serve us across a range of those. So it's building a strategic reserve of capabilities of not one sort, but potentially of many. But the fact that this way of thinking about the future goes all the way back to Clausewitz, I think just speaks to its validity claim.
So let's continue on that second piece where you talk about, which is the capabilities. And that's where I think this is a particularly fascinating way of looking at it, because very often when we work in the strategic scenarios and things of that sort, it's more about avoiding avoiding risk and loss, maybe finding a few opportunities, but it doesn't always go back into being very clear on the ability to build new capabilities. Sometimes those are inferred, make sure you have more people that you've talked to, know some other potential suppliers, things like that. When you're looking at this again, in the more traditional on paper version, you have a lot fewer pathways that you may look at. We may consolidate it into a handful of pathways to give broad elements. When you're looking here using the AI, you're able to build hundreds and hundreds of pathways. How do you look then at finding, I guess, the best bang for the buck in identifying which capabilities to develop? Because a government has a certain set of resources and a certain set of requirements, and it's the ultimate survival of the nation and the people. A business has a different set, which is what the board says to you and whether your shareholders are matching things or are happy with you and things of that sort. And therefore maybe a little bit resource constrained compared to a government, given that the stakes are very different. How do you look at those in that business component?
Fantastic question. The answer for both businesses and government is the same term, but that term is then defined and executed differently for both, and that's strategic value. So what it requires is for each of those, you saw the sub-pathway options, the options in each condition that we would ideally have, we have to assess the strategic value of that option, some estimation, some quantified estimate of in that circumstance, at an order of magnitude calibrated level, which by the way is infinitely specific to a given planning actor, be it a business or a government. What is the strategic value of that option? Now, keep in mind, we're doing that, as you've just said, across a vast number of pathways, each of which has a number of options. We try to constrain it in the modeling and in executing the AI. It's important to put boundaries on the number of options. So then we array those that way. We then identify the capabilities required for each. And then the calculation becomes then what are, first of all, the clusters of related capabilities? And then if the cluster were executed such that it would meet the requirement of a certain number of those sub-pathway options, which are those capabilities that create maximum strategic value? That's how we get a cut at it. Now, we all know from Foresight practitioners, this is I think, a very sophisticated means of very strong hypothesis generation. Once you've done it, the capability has to be validated, has to be costed, has to be planned and delivered. But what this methodology enables is to conceive of and identify. By the way, that's the scientific method. That's the core of human progress. It is, we have a reason to believe that this capability would maximize strategic value. And therefore, we cannot do to use at a first, for example, one representative run 925 discrete capabilities, we simply can't build them. But if there are, for example, 3 clusters of capabilities that build optionality and generate strategic value in that top tier, then they merit taking to ground truth, doing the real analysis, and building them.
So building on this too, as we look at this, how do you look at the reality that although businesses claim to think strategically, they are often held in 3-month blocks,
Oof.
which means that internal KPIs are in week and 2-week long blocks.
Yeah.
How do you take this and help businesses understand in a way that fits within their sort of vision of near-term cost versus long-term, the value of building in opportunity and options as opposed to just avoiding risk, I guess?
So your question couldn't be more germane to my lived experience over these last few months. So interestingly, we have never seen such a strong demand from the private sector for this kind of work. And the reason is surprising. It pertains to supply chain and strategic operations of global businesses. By the way, that's one of Kearney's deepest strengths. Strategic operations and supply chain is something where we just have, by the way, we're having our 100th anniversary this year. That is one of the pillars of our expertise. Well, it turns out that the geopolitical dynamics that we are now encountering, whereas before it was a longer term trend, what if at some point in the distant future there's a US-China conflict? What might that mean? In the current environment, whether it be geoeconomic change, for example, tariff changes in tariff arrangements, for example, or a Supreme Court ruling, and what does that change? Be it that, or be it specifically geopolitical risk or conflict, it even matters at the quarterly level. So it has implications for supply chains and for operations systems, for operations networks that it never did before. And so now private enterprises, corporations that are global, are seeing the need to understand what these changes mean, even in that quarterly timeframe. Because you're right, previously that also often limited the interest of clients in doing this work. But now the nature of the change and the way in which it affects operations is so manifest that they have to do it. And so that's really the sweet spot of the work that we're doing now, is where Foresight intersects with the network, with the operations of the firm. It's sort of the boundary between, if you will, the internal firm and the external operating environment. That is its global network, its manufacturing network, and its supply chains. And that is being hit and affected even in the quarterly time frame.
So again, I'm going to jump to one of the questions because it ties into this. Um, uh, when there may be options that may never be used, how do leaders, especially in business, sell these options? Um, because one of the things is building options and optionality. In an ideal world, you don't have to apply all of it, right? So we get back to the money question. We get back, and so like I said, we're going to have a
Love it.
variety of people who are very strategic, a variety of people who are coming in at this from the very tactical level. But how do we sell strategic optionality if they're not seeing it sort of need to be applied?
Yeah. I almost feel that that must have been a friend who asked me that question. You'll see why. Because the answer is so specific. We're not selling them that the option will be needed. What we need to say to leadership, whether it's in government, where I proudly served for 5 years, whether it's in the private sector, is the capability that we need to build. And the business case for building the capability is because of the extent to which it gives us choices across a range of circumstances and a range of options. That's actually, I could not have, I'm not kidding. I couldn't have asked for a more exquisite question. That's the thing we're saying is we need to build. By the way, when we do this work, there are many capabilities that the organizations already have. Great. For many of the options, we can say we have these capabilities. And of course, as we all know on this call, some of our main clients, the leading corporations in the world, have incredibly, for example, incredibly sophisticated government affairs capabilities, right? So tremendous policy analysis capabilities, which the analysis will reveal as necessary. Great, they have that. The question is, what are the capabilities that we don't have that create most value across a range of circumstances and give us, if you to put it simplistically, maximum optionality or maximum ability to meet those optionality requirements. So you're not selling the outcome or the specific option. You're not making the case for that. You're making for the capability to respond, and it's not just to that one.
How do you look at approaching these types of pathways? So are you looking at it as let me build a set of frameworks for the world and then let me come in and talk to your company? Or does it start with what's the company's goals, what's the company's issues, what's the company's operating environment, and then build out from
And
there?
strategy.
How how
Yeah.
how how collaborative is this?
Thank you for asking. It's very collaborative. And even that case study I showed in the black slides with the groovy lines, it is, it can be built into designing a strategy, but it can also take an existing strategy and then decide how do we make it adaptive in this way. But it is very, very specific to the planning entity, to the strategy that it is pursuing. Whereas, for example, scenario based, as we all know, I know Roger and I both are scenario practitioners. Scenario based strategic planning has in a way, a broader range of use cases because we can do it to design strategy and to test strategy. This is geared for making the strategies that we have much better. That is strengthening their adaptive capacity. So it is intimately tied to the planning actor, and it is intimately tied to the strategy. Now, in sourcing the shocks and the structural shifts that could be relevant to that strategy, of course, we maintain an inventory of those, but then we also have to do, by the way, machine learning enables scanning to identify those and build that universe. And that also is tailored to what they're doing. Because the question is, it's not just what are the universe of shocks in the world we could imagine. By the way, it does include that, but it's what are the universe of shocks that would directly affect, for example, in the case I gave, this food security strategy. We use the food security example because, as many of you may know, food security just touches all of the steep domains: social, technological, environmental. And so it's particularly rich. But that's the answer. It's tailored.
So there's a question that came in that matches to this, follows on. Could you share your perspective on how AI approaches the challenge of providing strategic foresight when it is trained primarily on historical patterns, and particularly how it adapts when facing conditions that are now new or without precedent?
Yeah, this is important. We never rely on what we call AI magic. So we never ask AI to anticipate and take its findings. And what we do in all of our work with AI, we first of all conduct the same analysis at the human level to understand the parameters of analysis and what makes for a good finding or not. We use that to design the prompts that we engineer. And in designing those prompts, we are super specific about sources and methods and evidentiary lines. But still, a lot of those sources and methods are backward looking, of course. But we do have data, including our own data. But also, this is the power of, by the way, I do want to give a plug to the amazing World Economic Forum's Global Foresight Network. I'm so proud to be on the advisory board of that organization. In that community of people, there are tremendous resources on, from the horizon scanning level of weak signals of potentially significant change to well-established trends. That whole spectrum, there is very rich and meaningful data from reputable sources on the boundaries of uncertainty. And so that's the data set, validated data about the future that we give it, strict guidelines on sources and methods and evidentiary frameworks. And before we do any of that, we do the human analysis first to see if it will work. And then even when we run it, of course, as everybody knows, we would never just take it willy-nilly. So even then, it has to all be validated. But what the AI does do is the universe of estimations required for this methodology is so vast, it would be a three-year effort, and the world would have changed so much. So at speed, it allows us to generate the universe of pathways, the options required. And again, the idea is actually not that a single option or pathway, the idea is what are the capabilities that across them. And so, by the way, the same, Roger and I know, the same principle applies in scenario planning. We build a scenario set. We know it's only analytically valid as a set. And it's not that we think one of those scenarios will occur, but rather, as a set, they contain the space of uncertainty, of future operating conditions for which we have to be ready. So, same principle of robustness.
Yeah, it's probably worth talking a little more on thinking about the way in which technology impacts the building strategic scenarios and things of that sort, or even being able to exist in this field. I know when I started at Stratfor back in the 90s, the whole reason the company was able to exist the way it did was Nexus. Yeah, everybody was
Yeah.
starting to digitize their typeset, and you were able, for the first time, to access a world of news without posting people in 100 different countries, cutting newspapers and mailing them to you. And that digitization, we've seen the acceleration of some of the ways in which information can be distributed at speed, and through social platforms to get it through alternate pathways. We've now got the AI piece. How have you engaged through your career with the changing technology landscape? And how is that, how does that changing technology landscape also impact geopolitical realities?
So for the audience might think these questions were scripted. They're not, but it's stunning to me. Anyway, You'll see what I mean. This is absolutely crucial to this methodology I've showed, but to Foresight in general, because to our point about resources, we don't have a universe of infinite resources. And so, one of the most important patterns we're seeing right now are national governments, defense organizations, and private sector companies that have built up costly capabilities, not just costly to build, but costly to sustain, that no longer are creating the strategic value for which they were intended. In other words, obsolescence, technological obsolescence. They have budget lines, they are funded. And so the same set of analytical lenses that I've described for what are the capabilities that we need can also be applied to the current portfolio of capabilities to see what are those capabilities that are either already obsolete or most likely to become obsolete. Because dynamic, for as we call it, dynamic portfolio management of capabilities is so absolutely crucial. And to your point, Roger, in that regard, understanding technological change is absolutely crucial. And right now, it's particularly difficult because progress is so fast. So we have to make certain assumptions about our best understanding about what is likely to be possible. So the universe of capabilities that is emerging from the methodology now, by the way, we also have to calibrate for the relative certainty that it's buildable, because we don't want to constrain ourselves to what we necessarily know we can build if we're trying to be ready for things that occur 5 years from now. So particularly with respect to AI and progress towards something like AGI. So even the capability sets have to have sort of basically a quotient of probability of value. We think this can be built, it should be explored. And that's what I meant when I said it's about generating hypotheses, which then have to be taken down to ground truth. So can we count on the innovation trajectory expected in this specific domain for this capability? And if the answer is a strong yes, then the investments, the bold bet to build it are there. In some cases, it's just too uncertain that that piece will be there, meaning the expected value of that investment is insufficient. So technological change has to be probability based. And by the way, one way that we do that, this is important. And this is why I'm not that fearful that AI will knock those of us who do foresight out, because the human frontier of knowledge is not fully encoded out in the world. And so we have at Kearney, through Silicon Foundry, a process by which we can go and engage with startups at the frontier of innovation across sectors. And just did one of these in San Francisco 2 weeks ago. It's really incredible for a client, taking them out, and we're meeting, by the way, meeting with VCs that have begun companies at different parts of the value chain relevant to them to understand what is the frontier, what are we capable of now, and what do we believe we'll be capable of in 5 years. You can't get that knowledge only through what's publicly available and only through AI. It's the human interaction. And also, of course, it's the conversation. And we know this, Roger, forget about that particular application. Speaking to practitioners, whether it's in a business, those at the front line of a business, those in government, certainly in military, this is true, who understand the actual reality of warfighting, or the actual reality of designing labor policy that works, for example. You can only learn so much through the universe, or the best literature review gets you 60% of the way there. It's when you speak to practitioners for a given actor that the frontier of change that matters, where technology would help or not, that's where it becomes more real.
How would you take a process like you've developed and put at least the concepts of it into a space where maybe somebody who has a very small team or doesn't come at it with the same amount of resources. The company might not view it as, it might not be that big, but still wants to start thinking about these ideas of how to think about strategic optionality, think about building in buckets of capabilities that give you those options. I don't want to say dumb down or simplify the process, but how do we take a bite-sized piece of it to apply some of the concepts that you've developed, even if we can't apply it in its fullness?
Yeah. I think the answer is, with the judicious application of the human guardrails that I described, one can use these incredibly powerful AI tools that are already publicly available as a small team to apply these principles to think about it, to begin to identify the universe of shocks, structural changes that would most matter. Okay, let's look at that universe. Then let's look at, given that and given our strategy, how might we need to adapt if that occurred? Remember, there's a two-stage rocket there, which might sound like a nuance without a difference, but it's not. One is, at a high level, how would we need to adapt? For example, if hydrocarbon prices were to precipitously decline, and they're right now going up. If they were to precipitously decline, then we would have greater fiscal constraints. So the broad adjustment we'd have to make in domain 27 of our food security strategy would be this. That is, we would need to make it more budget efficient. How could we do that? That's where you then go, what would be the options? And then you get to the options, you get to the capabilities. But this logic, I think, could be meaningfully applied by smaller teams, again, to generate meaningful hypotheses using tools that are out there. Anyone who wants to work on that, I'd be happy to give some thoughts on how it can be done that way. I will say that it's all about the strength of hypotheses that one can develop before building something, but I think it can be done. I think those teams can apply it in a light way that's meaningful and rigorous. The key are the guardrails. The key is not to rely on what we call AI magic. AI magic, by the way, is when you sort of say, hey, we've got this responsive AI. Okay, what is the argument? What is the causal logic of this recommendation? And if nobody knows, that's AI magic. And we try to exclude that.
Mm-hmm. So I guess if I were to break it apart, there's a couple pieces that happen sort of simultaneously. One is looking at the environment, and that's where you're identifying the places for potential strategic shocks, disruptions, things like that. That's the broad-based outside-in look. Then you're looking at the company strategy and the company position and where it fits and where it wants to go. And then you're trying to look at the way in which they overlap. Now, did I miss a step in there?
You didn't miss it, my friend. I would just invert the sequence. The first thing is, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve? So what is our strategy? That's the starting point. Why? I only make that distinction because that orients the shocks and shifts that will be relevant.
Okay.
So 100%, you've nailed it, but definitely it's starting with, this is the outcome we're trying to achieve. It's obviously geared towards outcomes that are longer term in nature, because we're talking about, so it is, over the next 3 years, we want to achieve this outcome. It is our 5-year strategy to achieve this outcome. And then that is the basis. Understanding, by the way, the actual steps of the strategy is crucial. So here are not in detail. By the way, a detailed strategy is great. It's even more. But then given the detail of the strategy, then we can say, what are the shocks that would affect those? And by the way, it's not willy-nilly sourcing of shocks. The shocks are already limited by so forgive me, but strategic shocks, for those who don't know, there's a whole, and it's needed, a methodology for generating those. But those are discrete events in time. They're often linked to trends. They're often thrown off of trends or at the intersection of trends. And it is a matter of choosing those that are most probable in a given time frame and most material in terms of how they affect the strategy. So that's already limiting the number of shocks that are included for consideration. The same is true for shifts. Yeah. So the selection is built based on the strategy. Sorry, go on, my friend.
Right. No. So that's really important, and I think this is critical too. I found that working with companies, even to go and sit down with them and say, well, what is your strategy? Sometimes it's not that clear to them, or different pieces of the organization haven't fully looked at it. And then, as you noted, as you go through the process, you may find capabilities that already exist that may not have been thought of in that term. So there's a lot of work, I think, that needs to be done in collaboration with the end user of a tool or a system like this, than just saying, hey, we can build this out and it's applicable. And that seems to be the case over and over again in doing, there is a frame of the world, but how it applies is very unique to each individual case.
You are so right. And you raise something very important. If I can just speak to the national government lens, it is remarkable, and this has been true of every government that I've ever supported with this kind of work, how much that the government doesn't know about the capabilities that it has. So in doing this work for a national government, for a prime minister's office, one of the first crucial steps is to begin to understand the capabilities resident in their ministries or their departments. And this goes back to my days in the US government, for example, where the Department of Agriculture had, cadre of PhDs in agricultural science that were just a brilliant cohort of expertise that was deeply relevant to things that DoD at that time, now the Department of War, was trying to solve. It didn't know that that repository of capability was there. So the larger the organization, the more likely that there are highly valuable components of capabilities out there from which you can draw. And by the way, that's one of the most satisfying things about Foresight. I always say it's the systematic application of common sense. Building that inventory of the capabilities that are out there is one of the most valuable things that a government can do. And that same thing does apply to large corporations. Large distributed corporations sometimes don't realize the capabilities that they have. So.
Yeah, and sometimes by large, we're talking once you pass 30 people, you stop paying attention to what everybody has.
Yeah.
But certainly on the big side, I'm going to jump to a couple more questions here. I'm going to combine a couple here because they bring back to this AI thing, and then we're going to jump back to the military issues because there's some thoughts there. And this is, let me kind of blend these two different questions together. Basically, one looks at the relationship between human intuition and AI in strategic foresight, and how do they differ? How comparable are they, and how might an organization integrate both effectively? And related to that, though, the cautionary one is, do you find AI magic as a source of confirmation bias? And seeing it in the AI, does it compel your analyst to then think that maybe it's true in that way? So I guess looking at both of these together, what's the balance between the human intuition and the AI? How do they interact? How does a company integrate them? And how do you potentially avoid confirmation bias when working with that?
What a great question. So, first of all, my interpretation of strategic intuition, and probably all of us, I hope all of us have had the privilege of working with a senior person, senior officer, a senior leader with just superb strategic intuition. Some of them, for that reason, that's part of why they rise to the positions that they achieve. And my interpretation of what that is the incredible, unique power of the human mind to accumulate experience, to see patterns, and over repetition and repetition, it becomes an intuition about what works and what doesn't. And so it is, as we all know, it's not science, but it is an incredibly powerful tool of hypothesis generation. And that's the beauty of thinking about life from the perspective of the scientific method, is it's generating a meaningful hypothesis. If the source of that is the strategic intuition of a leader, then great. And if it resonates, it seems true, that's intuition. And then it's validated by analysis and consulting. That's a lot of what we do. But I do think having the intuition is a form of what AI now replicates computationally, that they're not totally unrelated. But as far as confirmation bias, that's the point I try to emphasize. If we get a result from AI, and by the way, there are probably 25 prompt details critical to doing this well, but we demand or we require that the causal logic, the explanation, if you will. By the way, we're big, David Deutsch is a very important part of how we think about these things. So the explanation for a finding has to be clear, compelling, and traceable. And so AI magic is the sort of slang internal phrase. By the way, it's not documented in our methodology anywhere. It just refers to when the AI is generating something and can explain its causal logic. It can't decompose it. So we try to never, because the person who asked that question is so right. What we have learned in the early days of playing with AI is it can write so well. It can have the most, I pride myself on the use of language. You can read a paragraph from AI, it's just so well written, you think that almost has to be right. So before, that would have been a filter on rightness. An analyst whose thinking was not so clear couldn't write a good paragraph. Well, AI can write a masterful paragraph that upon inspection is either false or literally just idiotic, which is quite fun. So we go to great lengths to force the outputs of AI to document the causal logic within it. And so that's crucial. Now, so that's about intuition. Intuition is a source of hypotheses. AI is a source of hypotheses. We build guardrails and prompts that maximize the extent to which we can understand the causal logic behind it. And only when we're getting that level of fidelity can we then apply it at the large numbers required for a methodology like the one we've described.
And I would imagine that many of the same structured analytic techniques that have been developed and designed to deal with cognitive biases and analytical biases are the same ones that we could apply
$100.
both to our human analysts and to our robot overlord analysts
Exactly
as they
right.
interact with each other.
Exactly right. And by the way, and you remind me of something that we have in common, you and I, Roger, in our background, and maybe others on the call. Triangulation is so important. So this is, by the way, particularly doable with capabilities. So identifying a set of capabilities that are highest value using this technique, but then you can take a set of robust scenarios for the same planning actor, developed completely independently, and then just assess how valuable would that capability be in these scenarios. We call that triangulation. It means testing the same artifact in through two totally independent analytic lenses. And that can also expose sometimes a vulnerability or something we didn't see, or this idea was not as good as we thought.
So we're getting close to the end. I want to get a couple more questions in here. One of them I think is going to be useful for everybody, and this is asking back from earlier. What articles or books would you suggest to learn more about some of the military or other underpinnings to the thought processes and tools that we have been discussing? So for those who want to go dig in and start looking, I know you've mentioned Clausewitz, and we could run through all of the classics. Are there places that you would suggest that people start to explore to expand their thought processes?
I love it. Well, I would definitely recommend the magisterial strategy by Lawrence Friedman on the military side. That's impeccable. Of course, there's Little Heart, and there are, you can go more deeply into the history, but Lawrence Friedman was such an incredible thinker and has created such a useful, it's obviously a big piece to take on, but extremely valuable. I can't recommend it highly enough. The other book I recommend, and I have for years since it was written, is David Deutsch's book, The Beginnings of Infinity, only because he provides clarity on the power and importance of precision of explanation. And to me, that's a crucial discipline to ensuring that this work is not arbitrary. Um, it's an unending process of refinement, of course, but to get it right and do it properly, there are principles there that are very valuable. That's not a book about military. That's a book about the nature of reality, quite honestly, but I highly recommend it. The classics are worth, I think, reviewing, of course. And by the way, it's become passe. You're afraid to mention it, but we shouldn't be. Sun Tzu. I mean, to not read, so reading Clausewitz, reading Sun Tzu, there is great value in reading the classics. I know I benefit from them to this day, including in designing this methodology, as I mentioned. By the way, it didn't pre-exist, but pieces and concepts that were there did emerge that were very useful. And whoever that is, please reach out to me. I have you can tell, I have a much longer and better list, but I don't want to go on too long.
I, I think one of the things that we'll do with S4Geo is start to collect all of this stuff and put a place for people to find and learn, because that's a big part of what we're trying to do here is to help people expand their toolkit, test the tools that they're using, think of different methodologies, learn different approaches. We probably have some parallel books in our bookcases behind us, and then a whole bunch that are different, and can learn a lot from each other there. So I do think it is key to keep looking and reading. I'm a big fan of the classics. I think going and looking at readings on military logistics, things of that sort. I think Luttwak has some stuff on that. I think there's a whole load of people. Interestingly, I've been really impressed with a lot of stuff from the 1970s and 80s in military literature, because that's when it was last perceived that everything was an existential crisis and we were going to go to thermonuclear war. And therefore, there was a lot of really clear-headed and sharp-focused insight on thinking about things in very complex ways.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
And listen, and so that's why, as you respond, Roger, there's in grand strategy, there's a whole column of readings. In military strategy, there's a column of readings. In strategic foresight, there's a column of readings. And so if that person reaches out, because yeah, it's hard to cut across those different categories because don't. I mean, Brzezinski. You have to read Brzezinski to understand grand strategy, in my opinion. You have to read Kissinger to understand grand strategy. Not because you have to agree, not because they are right, but because the parameters of thinking are laid out so clearly.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point that you're bringing up too, is we don't read all of these things just to say, I'm now a disciple of that person or I'm going to agree with everything they say. We look for how the thought processes are put together. What is the way in which they think? What are the things that they're looking at? What's the structure of argumentation? And it's not to agree, it's to find alternative perspectives. The more lenses you can look at something through, ultimately, the more accurate you're going to be.
I could not agree more.
Well, we didn't quite get every question, but we'll get a few at another point. I really want to thank you, Rudolph, for being here. This was a great discussion. It was great to kick off our talks on tools, techniques, and methodologies. Um, Thanks for being here. For those who are online, we will post this later in case you miss it or want to come back. And I think we have an action item for S4Geo, which is to start building the reading list.
And Roger, I couldn't thank you for moderating this enough, moderating so skillfully. Thanks for everybody for being here. It was a privilege. Honestly, it was a pleasure.